Bonjour Keweenaw, hello everyone, this is Braden Butterfield. Wiikwedong. Thank you for listening to the very first episode of this series brought to you by the KBIC Natural Resources Department. Today's episode features Roger LaBine.
Anin, Matiguna Bay Indigenous, Gigudu Dem, Gete-gitigaaning and Unjiba, Ojibwe Anishinaabe and Dao. What I said was my spirit name is Matiguna Bay. That's how I'm recognized in the spirit world. And I'm from the fish clan, the sturgeon clan. And I'm from Gete-gitigaaning, which means land of the old gardens, which is the name of my reservation over at Vieux of my ancestors. And then I'm from the Ojibwe Nation.
Roger is a water resource technician for the Vieux band of Chippewa. He is a wild rice specialist as well as a cultural leader. He was in the area for a Manoomin workshop. He would be presenting on regional and state-specific Manoomin policy and legislation. Roger describes Manoomin as a gift from our Creator and a part of who we are as a people.
As my mentor and my elders have taught me, is that it's part of my identity as Anishinaabe. And my presence here on Mother Earth is because of the Manoomin and the migration story and what it means to us. And so Manoomin is a very, very sacred gift to our people, and our community really honors that spirit of the Manoomin.
Roger understands that an important responsibility is passing on the knowledge to the next generation.
That spirit of that Manoomin is a place that we honor and respect, and so we need to teach that to our children, to honor this resource, because one of the things is this is the only place on Mother Earth that it grows is in the Great Lakes Basin. And so it's where our prophecies told us that we needed to be. We would know we would be home on our new land when we found this food that grows on the water. So it's come to be one of our staple foods in our survival. It was able to used to carry us through those severe winters when we couldn't get out and harvest, and that if we had plenty of Manoomin, we could stay in our wigwams and be able to sustain and survive.
Manoomin is an annual plant, which means each plant has a 1-year life cycle.
And so one of the things that we are taught in trying to honor and respect that life cycle is every spring we go out and we make that petition to those seeds that have fallen that fall before and that have grown and germinated under the ice. And as that ice out melts and we start that new cycle, just like a lot of other animals, we go out and we petition that site, that Manoomin Gete-gitigaaning, and we talk to all of those beings. We talk to that Manoomin spirit and recognize them and ask them to give us what we need. Come the fall, we will take care of it. It is something that we really like to have, and it's part of, because it's part of our feasts, it's part of our ceremonies, it's part of who we are. It's very important to us nutritionally and health-wise. It's very important to us.
Did you know that wild rice is actually an aquatic grass seed often referred to as a pseudograin or false grain? But that doesn't mean wild rice doesn't measure up to a true grain like rice. In fact, wild rice boasts higher nutrition than regular rice. With more protein, minerals, and B vitamins per serving, it's also low in fat and, like other pseudograins such as quinoa or flaxseed, gluten-free. Roger is happy with how things are going, and he's glad to see involvement from other tribes in Michigan.
And this has been so successful that it's my understanding that NOAA is applying for another grant to make sure that it's for the Great Lakes Basin, to include a lot of other tribes in Michigan and probably our brothers and sisters to the north, to bring them in, because there is a desire and there is a need that the tribal communities are reaching out, and they need to enter into these restoration programs, which has been going on throughout the state. I believe that all of the 12 tribes in Michigan now have a restoration project at some point. Some are a little ahead of others, but so I was honored to come here to participate, be one of the presenters, and I just like to do education and outreach regarding Manoomin.
Restoration. We asked Roger what that entails. And it's more than just finding the right environment and planting some seeds.
Restoration means inviting that in a tribal community, it means inviting that spirit of Manoomin back to their community, because over the years, with that civilization and the industrialization that happened in the state of Michigan, this resource that was very dominant throughout the land and very, very important to the Anishinaabe people, was not recognized, and there was little consultation of any, and so the resource. I mean, the Manoomin today. Even in some of the lakes in Michigan, it's regarded as a nuisance or invasive species or a weed. So a lot of the non-tribal people have no respect for it and use herbicides to try to remove it or pull it up or do whatever. They have no respect for it. But it's something that it's been moving towards a restoration. As I said, all the 12 tribes have some sort of, or at some stage, a restoration project to identify, some of the historic lands, to find some remnant stands of the wild rice, to enhance them, to bring back that rice to their community, because in some communities the wild rice, the processing and the stories and the significance, the spiritual importance of it, have disappeared because of the civilization and assimilation of the federal government, the boarding schools, and a lot of other things that's happened in the past to the tribal communities. And so there is a revival of that spirit being brought up in our tribal communities, and the tribal communities are realizing that this resource is very, very important to them as a community and to their identity.
Roger goes over the history of the disappearance of his tribe's sources of Manoomin and what they've been doing to bring it back.
On our traditional lands at Wiikwedong, in the late 1800s, it was a site where it was known as the crossroads, because prior to that, the main modes of travel was through the waterways, and the main travel was through jiman, or the canoe. And so this place where Gete-gitigaaning is, it's located in a town just south of Waters Meet. And that town of Waters Meet was named because where the reservation currently resides is that it is the headwaters, or waters from that land, go in three directions. One is, a major portion of it goes into Lac Vieux, which goes into the Mississippi watershed. There's a part of it that goes down the Ontonagon River system into Lake Superior. And into the east, it's the Paint River that goes into Lake Michigan. And so when the logging era came in, there was a dam that was put up in the late 1800s, 1900s, as that logging era came through, and so they could move those logs down the river. And so in 1937, the Wisconsin Valley bought that dam from the lumber company and turned it into a reservoir or a flowage as a backup for all those power stations and factories for down the Wisconsin River. It is said that the Wisconsin River is one of those hardest working rivers, just very similar to the Mississippi. And so, but the problem is when they built that final dam and the one that exists today and put into operation the dam in 1937, it started raising that water levels. And those rising water levels caused our rice to disappear. Our oral history talks about, and my ancestors, my grandparents, and my mentor, Naganash, talks about being able to watch on an annual basis those rice beds just shrink, till in the 1950s where there was no more rice. And so my family, in order to keep this, which was important to us in our families, our ceremony, and to our diet, we would have to go into northern Wisconsin and harvest wild rice from those beds in northern Wisconsin. And so later on, before my uncle walked on, he had this vision that he would like to return or have that wild rice return to our community and make it available for the next 7 generations. And so that wild rice bed in the mid-1980s was a project that started. And at the same time, GLFWC, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, started to become into existence under the Vieux decision. And so one of the early projects by GLFWC was to do this restoration on our traditional homelands, Lac-Vieux. And my uncle, who was the first delegate to the Vieux Task Force on behalf of Lac-Vieux, worked with the biological services and developed a plan to return the rice to Lac-Vieux. And from there, we entered into a fight with Wisconsin Valley, who disagreed that the higher water levels was the cause of the diminishing and disappearing of our wild rice. So we ended up taking them to court, and then when they tried to get their FERC license in 1987, because they had a 50-year license, some of the people that supported the tribe, including GLFWC, the BIA, the Wisconsin DNR, Michigan DNR, put some stipulations on their to lower the water levels. But they appealed that for almost 15 years. It wasn't until 2002, when we were at the Sixth Circuit Court, that they finally decided that they would not pursue this. And so the court also ordered that the water needed to be lowered. And so then ordered the WVIC to seed for the first 4 years, and the tribe and I agreed that seeding would allow, or we would allow that seeding to propagate and to see what would happen. And so as a result of that, in 2008, the tribe basically opened up the rice beds, because the rice beds had returned to the village and to our traditional lands, and our tribal membership could go again once harvest that wild rice. And in 2008 was the first wild rice camp since the early 1920s in which that processing was done. And it was those pictures of that rice camp that finally convinced Wisconsin Valley that they changed and became open. They became sensitive to working with the tribe to do that. And so one of the things is they've been very cooperative in trying to maintain that water level to keep our restored wild rice bed. And as a matter of fact, we, up until that point, the tribe actually sought to get the status from the U.S. Park Service. And in December of 2015, we had a rare awarding of status. We got that traditional cultural property, which gave us a seat at any decision making when it comes to the water level or impact on a wild rice bed, and with the Forest Service. We enter into an agreement with the Forest Service that that rice bed would be managed for perpetuity, because that was what the deciding of the tribe would be, and the Wisconsin Valley kind of agreed with that. So now the WVIC is doing a feasibility to make sure, or if in 2026 they're going to reapply for another FERC license, because of the low volume of water that needs to be maintained in Lac Vieux. They say they're not making any money and that, so it's not good for them to maintain that license. So, but right now the rice bed is going through a slight decline, and the environmental department is going over and trying to determine if there is some other cause other than the water levels to the decline of the rice bed. But it is the rice bed there came back after almost 50 years, and it grew. So now we just need to look at and try to determine what we need to do to maintain that rice bed.
Earlier, Roger mentioned how Manoomin was part of who we are. He also mentioned how it's connected to our migration story.
Years ago, before we were invaded by those Westerners, our ancestors used to live up by the mouth of the St. Lawrence Seaway, and actually more so north of the Seaway, and but also including Maine. And there was this Quay who had this dream, and in this dream there was this woman who was standing on the back of a turtle, and she was looking at that sunset. And so she went to the spiritual leaders to ask for an interpretation of that dream. And as those spiritual leaders were asking for answers, there were 7 beings that came out of the water and came to them 7 times and gave them 7 prophecies. The 2 prophecies that are very, very important to remember in the migration story as it relates to us, is that the first one said that we needed to leave, because if we didn't leave, we were going to face death and destruction. And when you look at historically right now, how many of the tribal communities, which was all the way from Maine all the way to Florida along that eastern seaboard, how many federally recognized tribes to this day do you know of that exist on that eastern seaboard? The only ones that exist today are the ones that have been relocated. But prior to the arrival, that first prophecy said that we were going to be visited by some visitors that were going to be coming on those logs with clouds. And what we needed to do was we needed to leave, because if we didn't, we were going to face death and destruction. And we were needed to follow that Migas, and we needed to follow that Migas to the west. And so along the way there are 7 stops. And so there's really no accuracy or consensus on how long this migration took. But the third prophecy said that we needed to follow that migas until we arrived at this land where there's food that grows on the water. When we found that food that grows on the water, we would know that we would be home, and this would be our new home. And so the Three Fires people, the Chippewa, Odawa, and Potawatomi tribes, started their migration. Even though at that point it's been told in our oral history, no matter which direction that you looked, all you could see was those fires from the Three Fires people. But actually, as well as that, is that the resources were becoming limited. So not only was the need to leave because, surviving was becoming more difficult, more competitive. So we needed to leave. But we started up that St. Lawrence Seaway and come to Niagara Falls and along all the way. And so that migration story the migration stopped at Madeline Island, which is on the western end of Lake Superior. And so that became the final resting spot. And from there, our people was the first, if you wanted to consider it, would be the first capital of the Indian nations, was on Madeline Island. But even as big as Madeline Island is, again, it became very, very populated. And so the bands or families started breaking off. And so today we have, we're the Lac-Vieux band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, the Mole Lake, all the other tribes of Michigan. Our bands are the Lake Superior Chippewa with their home at the Madeline Island. And so we also looked at that as, when the fur traders came and everything, that's where we considered basically our capital. It was the first capital of the Ojibwe Nation.
The Lac-Vieux band of Lake Superior Chippewa and the Keweenaw Bay Indian community have been described as sister tribes. Roger explains why.
Well, I think it's 1934, if my memory serves me correct, IRA was passed by the federal government, which was the Indian Reorganization Act. And so as part of that, and when Michigan was actually being considered to become a state, they needed to kind of centralize a lot of the tribes, not only for their treaties and everything else, but they tried to put them all into one place. And so some say 3, some say 4 bands were actually committed to or relocated from where they currently existed. One of the bands was the Ontonagon Band over by Ontonagon, by the mouth of the Ontonagon River. The other was, one of the bands was the Ontonagon Band over by Ontonagon, by the mouth of the Ontonagon River. The other was the Lac-Vieux Band over there by Waters Meet. Some say that even the Chickagan Band over by Chickagan Lake, in between Iron River and Crystal Falls, was actually part of those people that were to be relocated at Keweenaw Bay Indian Community, or Assinins and Baraga. So the federal government only recognized us. They didn't recognize the Ontonagon or Lac-Vieux bands because we were actually now part of the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. But when so we were that was part of their civilization and assimilation, and actually probably the boarding school era, and trying to teach the youth one of two things. One of the things that you had a choice of was either becoming Catholic or becoming Methodist. And it's my understanding that the Catholics were over in the Assinins and the Methodists were over in Ziba. However, the people of Lac-Vieux weren't really accustomed to survival off the lake. They were more accustomed to inland subsistence living rather than depending on Gete-gitigaaning. The other thing that they didn't like was because one of the things that they couldn't do is they couldn't practice their ceremonies and their beliefs and didn't recognize their spirituality. And so our spiritual ancestors decided that they were going to leave this community and go back to Lac-Vieux or Gete-gitigaaning. And the spiritual leaders left and they went back. And so when that land came up for sale, the elders, they went out and they harvested and furs and trapped. And so in the spring they took their furs to Marquette. And when from that proceeds of sale, they decided they were going to buy some land. And so that land was, even though the Gete-gitigaaning people had lived on that land for centuries, they had to buy it back. And so what they did is, and actually the people, the village used to be out on the islands. But when that land came up for sale, the most expensive property was those islands. But what they wanted to do is they wanted to get home. And so there were several things that they cherished. One is the rice bed in Rice Bay. Two is, and maybe number one would be the burial grounds, the cemetery. So in addition to that, it was the sugar bush, because two of the staple foods that was the main backbone to survival was maple sugar and wild rice. If you had those things, you could really hunker down in those cold winters and still survive. And so when we called the sister tribes, it was because even though we returned to our original lands, we still became somewhat dependent on those annuities from those treaties. And so there was a trail that was developed and is recognized today in between the Lac-Vieux and Keweenaw communities. And so we were actually under the federal government. We were all members of Keweenaw Indian community until we earned our own federal recognition once again in 1987 or 1988. Ronald Reagan signed us and declared us a federal recognized tribe. So we became independent of Keweenaw. And as a matter of fact, prior to us getting our federal recognition, in 1972, because of our sister tribes and our status, the first original HUD programming, 15 units, was granted and given and gifted to the Lac-Vieux community by the KBIC community, and assisted the tribe in getting their first 15 low-income housing units, which still exist today. So that working relationship between LVD and KB has been long-standing.
He then went on to tell us how he first came to walk the path he does and why he walks it.
Years ago, when I was first introduced to Manoomin, once again our rice bed on Lac-Vieux had disappeared. But in our teachings that we needed to have wild rice in our homes and to keep it, those teachings and that alive, we used to go into northern Wisconsin. And, back then, we would actually go and we would camp down there. And so, because rather than commuting back and forth, because we didn't have dependable vehicles or that. So my first experience was going down there and helping my elders and doing that. And so when the when Naganash, my mentor, the guy who I continue to do this work for, was my inspiration. And I told him I would continue to do his work. And so after he had walked on in 1999, he had initiated this restoration project specifically on Lac-Vieux-des-Erts, but because of the problems we were having on Lac-Vieux-des-Erts, there were several alternate sites that were selected in cooperation with the U.S. Forest Service. Those two sites mainly were Crooked Lake and the middle branch of the Okanagan River, where historically our people knew that there was wild rice. So we needed to have an alternative site because the vision of Naganash was to have that rice available in our community where we wouldn't have to commute and gather and harvest it. So in my doing so was I was inspired by the Native Wild Rice Coalition. In 2006, we held the first Wild Rice Conference, and it was a regional conference where we had people from the University of Minnesota, with people from University Wisconsin Extension Service, Patrick Robinson, Scott Heron from Ferris State University, and we had several other sponsors in this thing. And so when we, because it was a vision to, again, as my uncle wanted, was to restore wild rice in the Great Lakes Basin, and specifically in Lac-Vieux-des-Erts. And so after the 2006 conference, all the people met, and so we formed the Native Wild Rice Coalition. And in that membership, one of the missions or goals, well, they had a mission statement, but then we had one of the goals was to, as these restoration were being successful, and actually, and even some of the rice beds in Minnesota and northern Wisconsin, where we would actually start incorporating and reviving these techniques and practices in the tribal community. So with the success of the wild rice bed in 2008, we secured some funding. Actually, one of my dear friends out of MNFI wrote a grant, and so the first wild rice camp in 2008 was fully sponsored, and it continues today as of last year. All of these rice camps are being conducted because they're being supported financially by sponsorships and grants, that it doesn't cost the individual or the family anything to attend these camps. So it's just a desire to attend and learn. And if your curiosity is piqued, hopefully we could answer any and all of your questions. So the first wild rice camp was conducted, by me in 2008, but the year prior to that, Earl Hoagland out in Minnesota actually conducted a camp. And so I kind of followed his format, but more so of what I recall of being out there on the lakes doing it. And, with the instructions from the Medewan Lodge, from my elders, my grandparents, the Ganash, I started to share those teachings that I had. I was sharing it with the people. So I've been doing wild rice camps now since 2008, and in some places or some years I do as many as 4 or 5 wild rice camps. It makes me feel very proud, is because before my uncle walked on, there's a DVD out there that was done by Michael Luukkonen, a sociology professor over at Northern Michigan University, and it's about Manoomin. And that DVD or that movie is in honor of Naganash, my uncle, who was my mentor. And when he became ill, he asked if, well, he called me to him, and he asked me if I knew of anybody who could continue this work. And I thought about it and everything, because I had been involved with it, with the family and everything. And I went home that night and I couldn't think of anybody. And so I was part of of a consulting company that I had developed. And when I was called home from a meeting out in Las Vegas, upon my mom coming to the airport to pick me up, she said, Naganosh needs to talk to you. And so I went to him and he asked me that question. And I went home that night and I didn't get any sleep. If I did, I got very little. So I went back to him the next day and I told him, I said, Uncle, I don't know of anybody. Do you think I can? And he goes, only if you're going to do that from your heart and from your mind. And so from then until he walked on, we worked together to do this. And I told him I would continue his work. And so when I do these things and I see the joy, and my target group is those youth. Those youth is the ones that I really, really, really reach out to, is because if these things are going to continue for the next 7 generations, it's got to start with them. And so my target group, and always in my camps, is those youth, is to spark that interest or give them a desire from their heart and from their mind to teach them these stories and make them want to become part of it themselves, to teach how to harvest it, how to respect it, how to process it, why it's here, their spirituality, the nutritional value, and what it really means to the Anishinaabe culture.
I asked Roger if there is anything else that he'd like to talk about before we ended the interview, and his final words were filled with hope.
At once I was supposed to retire, but I believe that the Creator has a different will for me. And as part of it, when I was considering retiring, a couple of things that I've been advocating for was that the state of Michigan recognize this resource, because for years it wasn't recognized. And one of the things that Wiikwedong and several of the other tribes, as they started their restoration projects, came into contact with, or hurdle, if you want to call it, was the uneducated general public outside of the tribal community. So one of the things that I've been advocating for is that we could get a group of people, very much like Minnesota and Wisconsin, that in Minnesota, the wild rice, or Manoomin, is considered a state grain. I mean, that's really, the tribes in Minnesota have worked with the state of Minnesota to come to appreciate wild rice. And they've had some problems there, mainly because of the rice paddies and cultivated rice that grows in Minnesota. One of the things that they're opposed to is the genetic research. But as a result of the Vieux decision in Wisconsin, they have basically a wild rice commission, which has tribal members and DNR people making and dealing with wild rice as a resource. But in Michigan, Michigan doesn't recognize, outside of the Aquatica, which is a river rice in southern Michigan, the palustris, which grows in the northern and through a majority of the state, through the destruction of it, I call environmental amnesia, and I borrow that from my friend Bart Barton. But and even in the communities with the assimilation, the boarding schools, and a lot of other things, a lot of the history, the processing, the teachings, the spirituality in the tribes disappeared. And now that it's being revived and being brought back, and the tribal communities are looking in that direction and trying to get and bringing back this sacred gift, we had a lot of problems in being successful on our restoration projects. And so it was a vision of mine that the state of Michigan would have this committee, or at least the tribes would be able to sit down with the state and discuss this resource and put in some management plans, put in some regulations. So 2 years ago, at the time I was about to retire, the outgoing governor decided that he was going to put this committee together, which means that all the 12 federally recognized tribes in Michigan would have a seat at that table, and that on the other side would be the DEQ, now Eagle, the DNR, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the governor would come back and look at this resource because of, again, environmental amnesia, that this resource that was once dominant across the state of Michigan has now but disappeared, and it's very, very limited. And so right now, part of the governor put together this committee, which is the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative. And so they have 5 subcommittees, which I chair the Education and Outreach Committee. But there is a lot of work that needs to be done. And I extend to anybody out there to find out about it and talk about it, or come talk to people at KBIC or at LVD. All the tribes in Michigan have a representative on this committee, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done, from whether it be, in getting a status for wild rice so it can be protected. There are some water laws that need to be revisited, and find out how we can get this management plan together. But I would like the state and the tribes to, again, recognize that this unique and sacred gift needs to be protected, and it needs to be restored and come back. And the tribal people can't do it by themselves. I believe that they have the experience. I think they have the knowledge. I think the tribes can take the lead on this and work with the state to bring it back to the way that it was many, many years ago, before a lot of the dams, the new roads, and everything else, and bring this wild rice back into its historic beds or whatever. But it's going to take a cooperative agreement between the tribes, the state government, and the general public to do this.
Again, my name is Braden Butterfield, and that's going to wrap up our first episode. This series is a partnership of Manoomin, Wiikwedong, the Keweenaw Bay Indian Community, Gete-gitigaaning, the Lac-Vieux Desert Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Office for Coastal Management. This collaboration has come together to listen and share stories of our work protecting and restoring Manoomin. For more episodes on this series, subscribe to the Keweenaw Bay Indian Community Natural Resources Department YouTube channel. The Natural Resources Department administers natural resource programs for KBIC on the L'Anse Marquette and Ontonagon reservations, as well as the western Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Thank you, Chimigwech, to all of our partners making this project possible. Thank you to Roger for taking the time to speak with us, and Chimigwech to all of you listening. Gigawabman!